And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Qbert today. I was here yesterday. I did a little talk about it was called Untold Stories of Video Game Development. How many of you guys were here for that? A number of you. That's great. And thank you for coming out for that. I hope you enjoyed it a little. Learned something maybe about what it was like in the heyday. But today we're talking about Qbert. Qbert, who, by the way, celebrated his 30th anniversary not too long ago. The game itself was developed in 1982. Didn't really get known or popular till 1983 because it took time. It was manufactured. I worked for Gottlieb, by the way. This is my original business card. Gottlieb Amusement Games, which at the time was owned by Columbia Pictures. It had just been purchased by Columbia Pictures, I think, in like 1977. Before that, it was a family-owned business, makers of pinball machines since probably, I think, the 1920s. D. Gottlieb and Company. Now you'll notice the address, it's 759 Industrial Drive in Bensenville, Illinois. This was in sort of a very nondescript business park, with very, boring looking buildings. And we were in a large building that had a large manufacturing plant that was empty when I started working there, because we weren't building any video games. Gottlieb had just gotten into the video games business when I was hired, and they were about to release their first homegrown game, and it was called Reactor. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Reactor. A guy named Tim Skelly, who was a well-known designer at the time. He worked for Cinematronics, did a lot of successful games there. Gottlieb hired him away to be kind of the guru to kind of start the department. There were, maybe 4 or 5 programmers at the time when I was hired. And my first job at Gottlieb was to help another programmer I did some supplemental programming on his game, which was based on the movie Superman 2, which was where Superman battled the 3 Kryptonian villains. Now, we didn't have the rights to use Superman, but we had a guy with a cape who flew, and 3 bad guys who flew around him and smashed into buildings and created rubble that landed on little people that were walking on the street below. And periodically, because as this rubble accumulated, we needed to get rid of it because it was taking up screen space, and there was a little bulldozer that came out and pushed the rubble away, and I wrote the code for that bulldozer. That was my introduction into the world of video games. That video game did not get released. It had problems. They did so many things to it. They gave it a million names. They put it out on test. Video Man was the original name. Protector was another name. Guardian. Then they went to something, they called it Argus for a little while. I don't even know what that meant. But, so we joked around, of course. We always made fun of it, and we called it ProVidGuard Argus. But it never went anywhere. At one point, they changed the image of the superhero character to be very rotund, because our vice president of engineering, Ron Waxman, was a very rotund guy, and he had like a Van Dyke beard, and we made the player character look like him. Super Waxman, we called it, and so we had some fun with that. It was a very interesting place to work. It was very much a think tank kind of environment. We weren't under any pressure. We had, like I said, the manufacturing plant was not up to speed. So we had a big empty space, and we wanted to fill it with games, but we really weren't pressured. We had no time pressure. But after ProVidGuard Argus, I basically, that was my inauguration, I guess you'd say, and it was time for me to make my own game. So at the time, at Gottlieb specifically, the programmers were the game designers. There were artists. Actually, I don't think we had too many artists. I think Jeff Lee may have been the only artist that we had at the time, and he worked on pretty much every game. But it was time to me to do a game of my own. So I really didn't have anything planned, or I didn't have any master plan for something, but I was walking by, and there was another programmer. His name's Kan Yabamoto, and he is known, if you are old video game aficionados, there was an arcade game that we released called Mad Planets, which actually was a somewhat successful game. That was Kan's game. But at the time, Kan was just sort of playing around with you know, experimenting with things, and he had some image on the screen that was the background image. We had two planes. We had a background image and a foreground image we could put up on our hardware, and so he was playing with, you know, just having these images in the foreground and the background, but the foreground image was an Escher pattern that, you know, looked, to your mind, even though it was two-dimensional, looked like cubes. It filled up the screen. And when I looked at it, I thought, okay, you know, I'm still kind of new at this. All I've done is a bulldozer. I'd like to learn to program certain things, and one of the things I wanted to play with was gravity, and one of the things I wanted to play with was randomness. And I thought, you know, if you pare down this screen of cubes into a pyramid, if something lands on the top cube, it has one of two places to go. You can represent that with a bit in computer language, and if you have 7 levels of cubes where, you know, you basically make a pyramid, well, then every time that ball hits, it has one of two choices. So with 7 bits, you can determine the ball's entire path. Well, a byte in computer lingo is 8 bits, so it's a very convenient storage thing to use for the path of a ball. So that was the thing, that was all I started out with. It was like, all right, I got this pyramid, I'm going to make balls bouncing down the pyramid. And I did. It's like, okay, that's pretty cool. So I taught myself randomness. Ooh. I taught myself randomness and gravity. The next thing was obviously, you know, and people would come around. You know, we were in a big room. We didn't have offices. We didn't even have cubicles. We pretty much had a big open space with tables. And we, you know, sorry, I was flashing back to another story I don't want to tell. So I thought the next thing, people would come by and say, wow, that really looks cool. And then okay, well, next thing to do is obviously a player character, somebody to jump around the cubes. And I went to our artist, Jeff Lee, and I said, do you have any characters that you've designed, you know? Because I didn't have a plan, per se. And he showed me a bunch of characters that he had made for some game that he had hoped somebody would do. But, you know, there was this oval orange guy with a long tubular nose. I said, yeah, that guy looks good. I'll use him. So I took that guy and I plopped him on the pyramid and I programmed him to jump around with a joystick. And you know, that looked cool, and everybody was happy with that. And then it was like, okay, well, what's next? So the entire development of Qbert had this sort of evolutionary flavor of, okay, that's cool, we added that, what's next? Now, I was the designer and programmer, that was my title. And basically, I consider myself the filter. Because, you know, honestly, people are walking by, they see what you're working on. Everybody had ideas. Oh, you should do this. Oh, you should do that. Oh, you should do this. So I consider myself the filter. If somebody said something, you should do that, and I thought it was a good idea, it was like, okay. And if you know, the vast majority of times, they were not so good ideas, and I passed. Jeff Lee, as you've noticed, Qbert has a long tubular nose, and Jeff Lee, the artist who created the character, had envisioned that character as shooting stuff out of that nose, because he is a whimsical kind of guy. And I think it's a funny idea too. Unfortunately, because of the physics of the game, there's a guy jumping in the way the nose is pointing. You know, he'd be shooting at things he'd be shooting out, and what would he be shooting at, and how do you aim it? There were too many questions, and honestly, I didn't want to make a game that was that complicated, and I didn't want to make a game that was that difficult to program. I was just trying to be easy. So I said, thank you, Jeff, but I don't think the shooting is going to work. I'm not interested in having him shoot anything out of his nose. And there's also a story that I have been telling over the years, which is really true, which is I was a big fan of Pac-Man at the time, which had already come out. The beautiful thing about Pac-Man is you can play it with one hand. Now, I played most of my video games in bars as opposed to arcades. It was very nice to be able to play a game when you had a drink in one hand. You know, like with this Defender, where you got, you know, you need every finger is doing something different. I was like, I don't want to do that. So simplicity was key. And we developed things. Actually, let me get ahead of myself here, but I'm going to do this. There you go. So what has changed? The address. The address is the only thing that has changed. Now, so we were in this place in Bensonville, and we, as a little group of video game guys, were the upstart new guys to Gottlieb. Now, Gottlieb is a company that had been going on for years and years, and there were many pinball designers who had worked there for many years and were revered as, pinball designers. And pinball was a game that had its ups and downs over the years, but boy, it had persevered certainly from the 1920s and evolved. And when video games came out, again, it's hard to imagine today if you weren't around then, but pinball, before video games, pinball was a huge, huge thing. There were arcade, when you thought of arcade, you were talking about pinball arcade. So when video games came out, everybody just latched onto these video games as the new thing, and pinball started to wane, became out of fashion. And the pinball guys were sort of, doing their own thing at Gottlieb. At this address, this was Gottlieb's main plant in Northlake. We were a few miles away in this other place in Bensonville, and at one point, Gottlieb decided, well, we should merge the two. This was right in the middle of the development of Qbert. So all of us video guys suddenly were thrown into a new place to work, which, by the way, was great because there was an Enterman's discount bakery a couple blocks away. It's really nice. Anyway, so we got thrown into this thing with all the pinball guys. Now, they made room for us. They gave us these cubicles. We had much bigger space and much nicer cubicles. But the pinball guys were kind of sort of shoved off into the corner. And so when we showed up, like the first day we showed up at Northlake, and we didn't know any of this. We didn't know any of the backstory. We didn't know any of the history. We didn't know any of the animosity. We show up and there's like all of these guys that we don't know just giving us the stink eye. Like, who are you? Well, and then eventually we kind of learned that what had happened. Now, management really screwed up. They just should have integrated us, done a mixer or something. They didn't. And we all had to do it on our own. But within a couple of weeks, things settled down. They were actually wonderful guys. And, we grew into a lovely family. Let's see. I have one photograph of me during Qbert days, which is horribly embarrassing. And it's a terrible picture. Sorry, can you see that? Okay. That's me during Qbert. Now, I apologize. This is the only picture I have from those days of me. The thing you'll see in the back there, that blue thing, that's what we developed on. Now, this was 1982. The Ibm Pc had just come out. And we actually transitioned from these to the Ibm Pc. But the Ibm Pc originally didn't have a hard disk. It only had floppy disks. The floppy disks each held 360 kilobytes. That was the entire, when the first hard disk came out, which was a miracle, it had 1 megabyte on the hard disk. That was like, oh wow, you could put a whole megabyte. That's what we were working with. Anyway, the blue box was made by Intel, and that was our development system. It hooked up through a cable into the hardware, which is actually sitting in front of the monitor. And you'll see that Qbert is upside down, the pyramid's upside down. We actually have the capacity in our hardware to flip the screen, and we use that for the version of these games called the tabletop version. I don't know if anybody's seen a tabletop version of Qbert, but they used to make these, they called them cocktail versions or whatever. You'd see them in bars. One person would sit at each end, so when your turn changed, the screen would flip. So I can only guess that that's why it's upside down. You'll also notice on the bottom left that there is a bucket. It's a Tupperware bucket with a joystick mounted on the bottom. The bucket is upside down. That was what I used. That was my control panel when we were developing. We didn't actually have cabinets to play with at the time because our first game, Reactor, had not quite gotten to the manufacturing plant. So that's the way it was back in 1982. I should also talk a little bit about the diagonal joystick thing. So there were, for some reason, people were very put off by a diagonally mounted joystick. They were always trying to straighten it out. And I'd be like, no, it's got to be diagonal. Because if you look at the game, if you look at the pyramid, his 4 choices of jumping are diagonal. It just seems very obvious. So it was always a mystery to me why that was so difficult a concept for people to grasp. But at the time it was. I cannot tell you how many times people would be like, why are you doing that? Can't you make it, you know? Very strange, didn't understand it.